You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. We all know that New Year's resolutions are hard. For example, everyone wants to go to the gym more, but actually dragging yourself out of bed in the morning and getting there is a whole other story. But what if you could make your resolutions automatic? Well, Acorns can't help you get to the gym, but they make it easy to start automatically saving and investing so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. And you don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. As we start off a new year, you don't need to feel like financial wellness is impossible. Acorns gives you small, simple steps to get you and your money on track. Head to acorns.com/CW or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid, non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/CW. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 479 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
We want to start this episode with a bit of a, programming note. Because here, with the spring and the summer of 1864, it's one of those times when we have some different things happening simultaneously with the war. And while we've already finished our look at the Red River Campaign, now we have other major story arcs coming up when we'll focus our attention on what was happening in Georgia and also talk about the goings-on in Virginia.
And so we just wanted to let you know that first off, we'll be covering the goings-on in Virginia with the Wilderness Campaign and also with the Shenandoah Valley and Bermuda Hundred.
Then we'll go down to Georgia and cover the Atlanta campaign and William Tecumseh Sherman versus Joe Johnston, then Sherman versus John Bell Hood. So anyway, we just wanted to give you guys a heads up that coming up on the podcast, Virginia will be first and Georgia will be second. So there you go.
As y'all will recall in the last episode, in connection with his strategy for the Federals to conduct simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts and in different theaters, we talked in pretty broad brushstrokes about Ulysses S. Grant's plans for the Eastern Theater of the war in the spring of 1864.
Ulysses S. Grant faced a daunting task in Virginia, which by and large, so far in the war, had been the graveyard of Union generals' military reputations. Because of the proximity of Washington and Richmond and the close coverage of the fighting in newspapers, the battles in the Eastern Theater captured an outsized portion of the North and the South and the world's attention.
Much of the poor federal showing in the Eastern Theater could be attributed to the subpar performances of a string of Union generals going up against the likes of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. But geography also played a substantial role.
By the spring of 1864, every news-literate person in America was familiar with the landscape of the war in the Eastern Theater. For all practical purposes, it consisted of a relatively small area in Northern Virginia, with Chesapeake Bay to the east and mountains to the west, all of which greatly reduced maneuvering room. In addition, the rivers in Virginia generally ran west to east, presenting numerous barriers to north-south movement. So, in a nutshell, out in the Western Theater, where Grant had made his reputation, geography favored the Federals. In Virginia, it did not.
It did not, that is, with one glaring exception. That's because the Federals enjoyed an overwhelming superiority in sea power, and so they could land and supply troops almost anywhere on the southern coast.
Well, that raised the possibility of landing somewhere along the coast and bypassing Virginia's inconvenient network of rivers, as George McClellan had done in his 1862 Peninsula Campaign. In fact, as we talked about in the last show, Grant, before he became General-in-Chief, in discussions with Halleck, had floated a variation of this strategy, in which a large number of reinforcements would be transported by sea to Suffolk in Southside Virginia. Then 60,000 Union soldiers would march from there into North Carolina and strike at the railroads that linked Virginia with the lower South.
However, Halleck raised objections to this plan, including letting Grant know that he doubted the president would approve of any strategy that called for the main blow in the Eastern Theater falling anywhere but on Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia.
Well, Halleck was almost certainly correct that striking Lee was politically vital, so Grant didn't pursue his North Carolina idea any further. From then on, Grant accepted that the main federal effort in the Eastern Theater in 1864 would have to be aimed at Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia.
But that didn't rule out a less powerful offensive starting out from southeastern Virginia that might still accomplish, on a smaller scale, much of what Grant had expected from his original plan.
It happened that there were about 21,500 federal troops in southeastern Virginia. Known officially as the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, this force defended Norfolk, Portsmouth, and several other locations in the Hampton Roads area, including Fort Monroe at the tip of the peninsula. Before now, little had been expected from this department in the way of offensive action, but Grant saw that by marching westward along the south bank of the James River, a force could threaten Richmond, complicate Confederate efforts to defend the rebel capital, and still shield the Hampton Roads area. Accordingly, Grant issued orders for the department to be reinforced by 10,000 men from 10th Corps, who were then lying idle along the South Carolina coast.
At the end of March, Grant went to Fort Monroe to visit the department commander, Major General Benjamin Butler. Butler, of course, is no stranger to longtime listeners of the podcast, from his role coining the term contraband to Hatteras Inlet in North Carolina to his time as military governor of New Orleans.
Upon meeting Butler, Grant discovered he had conceived a plan to threaten Richmond that resembled Grant's own. In fact, Butler's plan was better, since it called for an initial waterborne movement up the James River, and thus did away with the need for a slower overland march. The main point of debarkation would be Bermuda Hundred, a peninsula formed by the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers. Just beyond it lay one of the main railroads linking Richmond and Petersburg and the rest of the Confederacy.
Richmond itself was only 16 miles north of Bermuda Hundred. Petersburg, an important rail center in its own right, lay just 8 miles to the south. Once installed at Bermuda Hundred, Butler could threaten either place and perhaps seize one of them outright.
Even if seizing Richmond or Petersburg proved impossible, Butler's presence at Bermuda Hundred would require an energetic response from the Confederates and almost certainly divert reinforcements that otherwise might be sent to Lee's army. Well, Grant liked Butler's plan and gave it his approval.
Grant next had to consider how to get at the Army of Northern Virginia, which lay just beyond the Rapidan River, about 15 miles southwest of Culpeper Courthouse.
Lee's army occupied a string of encampments between Gordonsville and Orange Courthouse, with strong detachments posted to cover the Rapidan fords. From these positions, Lee guarded the vital railroad junction at Gordonsville, and he lay on the flank of any Federal thrust directly south toward Richmond. He also enjoyed easy access to the Shenandoah Valley, a region from which he drew substantial supplies and whose geography offered a protected route by which Lee could raid northward, as he had done the previous summer during the Gettysburg campaign.
The Army of the Potomac had 3 potential ways to get at Lee. The first, a headlong assault on the Rapidan River strongpoints, Grant rejected as obviously suicidal.
Grant toyed with the idea of moving around Lee's left or western flank, which would cut Lee off from any possibility of moving across the Potomac River and threatening the north. But Grant concluded that it would be too difficult to keep the Federal Army supplied if it made such a movement.
Grant finally decided that the best course would be to cross the Rapidan River east of, that is, below Lee's position. An advance by that route would be easier to supply. It would also be easier to link up with Butler should the need arise.
Grant left the details of the movement to the Army of the Potomac's commander, Major General George Meade. Meade's 3 predecessors, as you guys know, had been removed from command, and now Meade himself was under fire from critics who charged that he'd wanted to retreat from Gettysburg and that his subordinates had won the battle almost in spite of him. Well, such slanders were cruel as well as false. Still, the fact remained that in the 8 months since Gettysburg, Meade had been unable to bring Lee to battle. Indeed, on one occasion, Meade had been forced to fall back almost to Washington.
Well aware of his questionable reputation, Meade volunteered to step aside if Grant thought another general could do a better job. Although Grant, in fact, had been thinking of replacing Meade, his selfless gesture was so impressed Grant that he retained Meade in command. And so, while Grant planned to accompany the Army of the Potomac in the field during the upcoming campaign, he intended to leave its day-to-day management in George Meade's hands.
And so, to Meade's chief of staff, Brigadier General Andrew Humphreys, went the task of devising a plan to turn Lee's right flank. The chief obstacle was a dense tangle of second-growth woodland that covered about 70 square miles of northern Spotsylvania County, and that the Federals would encounter as soon as they crossed the Rapidan. It was called the Wilderness, and the Army of the Potomac knew it well from previous campaigns.
In May 1863, the Wilderness had been the scene of one of the Army's most humiliating defeats at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Then, under Meade, the following November, the Yankees had needed almost 30 hours to traverse the Wilderness, thereby permitting Lee to occupy a strong position along Mine Run at its western fringe, a position so strong that Meade had called off his offensive.
And so Humphreys had a healthy respect for the gloomy region. The dense growth of trees and brush meant that, except along the few main roads, it was extremely difficult to move organized bodies of troops through the area. The tangled terrain and limited road network meant the wilderness offered many advantages to the defender while complicating life for an attacker.
Therefore, Humphrey's plan called for the Army of the Potomac to race through the wilderness as quickly as possible to avoid having to fight at a disadvantage in such forbidding terrain.
Since Lee would probably respond by manning the Mine Run line, just as he had done the previous November, Humphrey's idea was to swing so widely around the rebel right that the Federals would reach the stream's headwaters and thereby nullify the line's defensive value. Ideally, the movement would be completed in one breathless day, that is, long before the Army of Northern Virginia, boiling up from its encampments around Orange Courthouse, could get close to interfere. Thus, with the Mine Run line rendered untenable, Lee would be obliged to retreat, or if he chose to fight, would have to do so in open country, where the Army of the Potomac could use its numerical superiority to advantage.
Meade liked Humphrey's plan, and so did Grant. Outmaneuvering Lee and forcing him to fight in open country would be ideal. Grant realized that Lee's situation could be made yet more difficult if federal forces lying idle in West Virginia were put to good use.
This thought led Grant to organize a third Virginia offensive, this one to be made by Major General Franz Sigel, the commander of the Department of West Virginia. Grant gave instructions for 2 columns to advance from Charleston, West Virginia, against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, and also strike at enemy lead mines and salt works. At the same time, Sigel would advance up the Shenandoah Valley and link up with those columns that had advanced from Charleston. All told, these movements would involve fewer than 20,000 men, but at a minimum, they could be expected to prevent Confederate forces in southwest Virginia from reinforcing Lee. And other than that, Grant wasn't expecting much from it all. But as he told Sherman, using a vivid frontier metaphor, quote, "If Sigel can't skin himself, he can hold a leg while someone else skins."
In addition to military considerations, there was no way Ulysses S. Grant could escape the political climate in which the Federals' 1864 spring campaigns would be waged.
That's because 1864 was a presidential election year. It would be only the second time Americans would choose their leader in wartime. The first had been during the War of 1812. And the outcome now was universally seen as crucial to the outcome of the Civil War, since if Abraham Lincoln lost, he would be succeeded by a Democrat, who would likely be in favor of pursuing a negotiated settlement, and thus ending the war with the Confederacy having secured its independence.
And Lincoln's defeat was quite conceivable. He was under fire politically on a number of fronts. His emancipation policy was deeply unpopular in many areas of the North, as was the draft. Critics charged that he had abused his authority through political arrest and the suspension of habeas corpus. Above all, there was a growing war weariness throughout the North as the conflict dragged on year after year, and many people questioned whether defeating the rebellion was worth the ever-escalating cost in blood and treasure.
The Confederates were also well aware that 1864 was a presidential election year in the North. In January 1864, a Georgia newspaper declared that, quote, "Every bullet we can send is the best ballot that can be deposited against Lincoln's election." And at least one rebel general proposed to mount an offensive for explicit political reasons. In March 1864, Lee's old warhorse, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, urged that Confederate forces march north into the border state of Kentucky, quote, as a political move. Such a campaign, Longstreet was certain, would result in the Yankees being, quote, greatly demoralized and disheartened.
Longstreet continued, saying, quote, Lincoln's reelection seems to depend upon the results of our efforts during the present year. If he is reelected, the war must continue, and I see no way of defeating his reelection except by military success.
On March 10th, at a meeting in Richmond attended by Longstreet, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Davis's senior military advisor, General Braxton Bragg, Longstreet's plan was discussed but rejected, but only because of practical obstacles, not flaws in its political logic. A movement up into Kentucky may not have been feasible, but Robert E. Lee still knew that influencing the North's presidential election depended on thwarting the upcoming federal campaigns, and so the Confederate armies would have to grasp any opportunity to frustrate the enemy's plans. He hoped that Joe Johnston, the commander of the Army of Tennessee down in Georgia, would do just that. And Lee, of course, looked tirelessly for an opening to strike at the Yankees in Virginia.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike Big Wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Kroger Delivery makes it easy to do your holiday shopping in a jingle. There might be a lot on your to-do list, but thanks to Kroger Delivery, you can get everything you need delivered straight to your door at the same great prices you'd find in store. Our refrigerated trucks always ensure that your groceries arrive fresh. And right now, you can save $20 on your first order of $75 or more and get free delivery with a Boost membership. Restrictions apply. See site for details. Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Robert E. Lee was always watching for an opening to strike the enemy in Virginia, but he was not without problems of his own. In April 1864, Lee informed Jefferson Davis that the returns for the previous month showed that almost 5,500 men, or almost 10% of his army, were absent without leave.
While many Confederate soldiers absent without leave were merely abusing a furlough or taking French leave, a growing number were deserters. Lee's solution was to shoot deserters when caught, and he urged Davis to grant clemency sparingly. Lee argued that such acts of mercy simply encouraged more men to desert. Lee believed executions were the only effective deterrent, and when weighed against the greater evil of permitting the army to be weakened through desertions, well, executions, he said, quote, will be found to be truly merciful in the end.
Lee's troubles didn't end there. His correspondence with Richmond during the winter of 1863-64 was one long lament about the shortage of supplies. The lack of sufficient food and forage not only caused real hardship amongst the Army's men and animals, but threatened to cripple Lee's ability to respond to the enemy's movements once the new campaigning season kicked off.
Even while the lack of supplies hurt Lee's army and desertion drained strength from it, Lee tried to gauge the Federals' intentions. For this, he relied on a loosely structured but extensive network of spies and scouts, many of whom were handled through Lee's cavalry chief, Major General Jeb Stuart, while others were reported through the Richmond Provost Marshal, or directly to Major Charles Venable, an officer on Lee's staff.
Robert E. Lee had no formal chief of intelligence. In effect, he held that job himself. Although his sources were unsophisticated, mostly scouting reports, civilian gossip, and northern newspapers, he still deduced a great deal.
And through careful evaluation of dozens of such reports, Lee almost perfectly divined Grant's plans for the Virginia campaign. On April 30th, he informed Jefferson Davis, quote, "Everything indicates a concentrated attack on this front, that is, the Rapidan."
Lee also predicted enemy troops in Sigel's department would strike toward the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad or move up the valley, threatening Stanton. Lee also anticipated Butler's movement, erring only in supposing that it would be a strong demonstration rather than a full-scale offensive.
Despite the impressive overall success, Lee's deductions failed him in one important respect, in that on the eve of the campaign, he estimated the Army of the Potomac's strength at only 75,000 men. In fact, Meade's army already numbered over 100,000 and would shortly be joined by over 16,000 men of the 9th Corps under Major General Ambrose Burnside. Lee thus underestimated the force he confronted by some 36%. And even when Longstreet returned from East Tennessee, the Army of Northern Virginia would have barely 64,000 men with which to oppose the main Federal effort, to say nothing of dealing with any trouble caused by Ben Butler and Franz Sigel.
In the spring of 1864, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia consisted of 3 infantry corps and a cavalry corps, and had been thus organized for nearly a year.
Longstreet led the 1st Corps, composed of 2 divisions totaling about 10,000 men.
Lieutenant General Dick Ewell led the 2nd Corps, composed of 3 divisions totaling some 17,200 men.
And Lieutenant General A.P. Hill led the 3rd Corps, composed of 3 divisions totaling just over 22,300 men.
Longstreet, Old Pete, when serving under Lee, was the most consistently competent of the 3. A.P. Hill was fiery but erratic and was often sick and out of sorts. Lee had the least confidence in Dick Ewell, having come to question his ability to make prompt, independent decisions.
Commanding the cavalry was Jeb Stuart. Aside from Lee and the dead hero Stonewall Jackson, Stuart was the most famous man in the Army of Northern Virginia. The other senior officers might be important names in the newspapers to the Confederate public, but Jeb Stuart was a genuine celebrity.
In the spring of 1864, the Army of the Potomac also consisted of 3 infantry corps and a cavalry corps. Interestingly, the Federal Corps commanders were oddly similar to their Confederate counterparts.
Longstreet's opposite number was Major General John Sedgwick, known as Uncle John to all his troops. Sedgwick led 6th Corps, composed of 3 divisions totaling about 24,000 men. Like Longstreet, he had a reputation for being dependable rather than brilliant.
Nearest in resemblance to A.P. Hill was Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, whose 2nd Corps contained 4 divisions and just over 26,600 men. Like Hill, Hancock led the largest corps in his army. He also possessed dash, and he too suffered from chronic health problems. In his case, complications from a wound received at Gettysburg that never properly healed.
And although no one knew it at the time, Major General Gouverneur K. Warren was a bit like Ewell in his inability to adjust to the demands of Corps Command. Ewell had problems exercising the independent judgments his position required, while Warren had a problem with micromanaging and delegating responsibility. During the upcoming campaign, Grant noticed Warren habitually took his 3 5th Corps divisions, totaling some 24,100 men, into action one at a time so that he could personally supervise the deployment of each.
Stewart's opposite number was Major General Philip Sheridan, who commanded the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, composed of 3 divisions totaling about 15,800 troopers.
The key difference between Jeb Stuart and Phil Sheridan was that whereas Stuart led cavalry throughout his Confederate military service, Sheridan, until recently, commanded infantry. And Sheridan differed from his fellow corps commanders in one other respect. That is, his previous Civil War experience was entirely in the Western theater. Grant, impressed by Sheridan's aggressive instincts, brought him east, expressly to command the Army of the Potomac's cavalry. In fact, during the upcoming campaign, Sheridan would function far more as Grant's subordinate than Meade's.
Separate from the Army of the Potomac, but destined to operate alongside it, was Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, composed of 4 divisions, totaling around 19,200 men.
Arriving in Northern Virginia in late April, after serving in East Tennessee and then undergoing reorganization at Annapolis, Maryland, Burnside's corps took up a position guarding the railroad that supplied Meade's army around Culpeper. Logically, 9th Corps ought to have been folded into the Army of the Potomac, but since Burnside was senior in rank to George Meade and had, in fact, as you guys know, once commanded the Army of the Potomac, now, to avoid any awkwardness, Burnside reported directly to Grant, though before the campaign ended, this cumbersome arrangement would be abandoned.
Going into the spring campaign, the Army of the Potomac may have enjoyed numerical superiority over the Army of Northern Virginia, but George Meade had one problem that Robert E. Lee did not, namely that the quality of Meade's soldiers was more uneven than Lee's.
Well, true, Lee's army received its share of raw conscripts, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 during the winter, but most of Lee's troops were veterans, and the new men who did arrive were sprinkled throughout existing regiments, where they rapidly learned the tricks of the soldiering trade from the veteran officers and troops.
However, in the Army of the Potomac, most of the Green troops belonged to new regiments with the scant leavening of veteran soldiers. One Union colonel estimated that as many as a third of Meade's men lacked combat experience.
Worse, the quality of the new men was suspect, mainly because of flawed federal manpower policies. You see, the Union armies had originally been made up of volunteers who freely enlisted from patriotism, love of adventure, or societal pressure. But by early 1863, that flow of volunteers had diminished, and the government was forced to turn to conscription. And so Congress passed the Enrollment Act, authorizing the draft. Designed less to obtain draftees than to threaten conscription if northern states didn't raise more volunteers, the Enrollment Act spurred state governments and local communities to offer substantial bounties, that is, cash payments, to men willing to enlist. While this increased the flow of volunteers, it also created the bounty jumper, a con artist who enlisted, collected the bounty, and deserted at the first opportunity to repeat the process in another community. And the bounty men who did remain in the army weren't trusted by the volunteers and were looked upon with contempt. All in all, most veterans considered the bounty men a curse rather than a source of additional fighting strength.
If the veterans really disliked the bounty men, or anything else about Army life for that matter, they could go home, because for many of them, their enlistments were about to expire.
These were the remaining Boys of 61, the original volunteers who answered the call to arms in the months after the firing on Fort Sumter. They had enlisted for 3 years in the spring and summer of 1861, and so their terms of service would end during the spring and summer of 1864. In theory, the government might have simply compelled them to stay, as the Confederate government did. But politically, this was impossible for the Lincoln administration.
Instead, Washington offered bonuses and furloughs as enticements to reenlist. Ultimately, some 27,000 veterans in the Army of the Potomac extended their enlistments.
But thousands more declined to do so, and since their terms of service were due to expire during the upcoming campaign, many of them were naturally less willing to run risks they might have undertaken earlier. In other words, nobody wanted to get shot just weeks before he could go home for good. And so, between conscripts, bounty men, and short-timers, the Army of the Potomac was a less potent instrument of war than it had been even 6 months previously. One soldier dismissed out of hand, quote, "worthless bounty jumpers and such trash," end quote, and assessed the raw recruits as little more than, quote, "pigeons for Lee's veterans to shoot at."
In any case, Meade would still have about 65,000 experienced troops for the coming campaign. Adding the veterans in Burnside's 9th Corps, that gave the Federals just a shade over 70,000 seasoned troops to throw at Lee's army, a number, though, that included thousands of men whose enlistments were about to expire.
Even so, most of the men had faith in Meade and Grant, and overall the Army of the Potomac's morale was excellent, as was its material condition. Its quartermaster, Brigadier General Rufus Ingalls, believed that probably no army in history, quote, "was in better condition in every respect," end quote. Indeed, by the spring of 1864, the troops had abundant clothing, good equipment, plentiful rations, and an efficient logistical system through which those supplies flowed in a continual stream. Nevertheless, the men had few illusions about the upcoming campaign. An officer in a Pennsylvania regiment no doubt spoke for many of his fellow soldiers when he wrote, in an April letter to his father, "I have great confidence in our army and leaders, but the road to Richmond is long and tough."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Maps of the Wilderness by Bradley M. Gottfried.
This title is a part of Savis Beattie's Military Atlas series, which chronicles many Civil War battles and campaigns. And like the other books in the series, it's a great resource to have at hand while you're studying the particular operation in question. In this case, the goings-on in the wilderness during the first week of May, 1864.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
You can also find our contact info and other stuff at the website, including how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like our newest members, Michael C., Cam, Tom G., and John F.
Thomas, Neil G., John B., and Jacqueline L.
Dro, David W., John O., and Frisenspark. Well, thank you, one and all.
And also a big thank you to Eric, Stu, Bob, Joseph, and Marcia for their donations.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.